Hello, and welcome back to the World of Wysteria. Today, I'm going to be reading Chapter 4. It was soon time to prepare for another night of dreaming. Setting his book down on the table next to his chair and looking across the room at his bed, Will couldn't help smiling, for beneath those covers lay the gateway to another world. How should I spend my time there tonight? He asked himself. Exploring the forest? Perhaps. But he then began wondering what might exist beyond the town in the other uninvestigated directions, to the north, east, and south. Had those landscapes been determined already? And if not, was there a way he could determine their content? Clearly, the creation of things in his dreams, lucid or not, happened on a subliminal level, a level his conscious mind could not directly access. However, through trial and error, he had discovered how to turn the changeable and oftentimes fuzzy dreamscapes into a place that felt as solid and reliable as his waking world. I can do that intentionally, he thought. Though his thoughts and feelings, the expectations responsible for the creation, were subconscious, if he could discover a method of influencing those particular brain waves, it would, in effect, give him some degree of conscious control over the creative process. The first step, I suppose, is to decide what I would like to see there. One thing that seemed to be missing in the town was a park or large garden, a green space filled with trees and flowers, perhaps some water features, ornamental ponds with goldfish and aquatic lilies, and meandering streams crossed occasionally by arched bridges. Yes, he thought, that would be nice. After turning off the lights and climbing into bed, Will closed his eyes and pictured such a place in his mind, imagining himself already there, walking across the grass under a canopy of leafy boughs, with the sweet aroma of flowers wafting through the air. Within minutes, measured by the clock on his nightstand, Will was back in the town square, standing near the large archway on the southern wall. As he gazed at the now familiar scene, it suddenly occurred to him that this place of his didn't have a name, at least not that he knew of. It was strange that he hadn't considered this before. Should I give it a name, he wondered? Or, like Lily, did it already have one? He could ask one of the townspeople. That might be interesting. But after giving it some thought, he decided that when the time was right, the name would probably reveal itself. Will then turned and peered through the gate. What was behind that wall at the end of the street? Though still somewhat uneasy about investigating that part of town, given his experience in the first dream, he decided it was time to put aside his apprehension and see what was on the other side of those doors. The scene ahead of him was slightly hazy, so he moved slowly down the street, taking time to bring his surroundings into focus. He now saw that the road, which he thought had simply terminated at the doors, actually joined another street that ran to the right and left along the wall, forming a T intersection. As he moved closer to the junction, he could see that this perpendicular road, like the wall, stretched for several hundred yards in both directions before turning south, making the enclosed area much larger than the town square. The wall itself was no more than 12 feet high, and he could see nothing but sky above it. If there were buildings behind the wall, they couldn't be more than a single story tall. Coming to the intersection, Will crossed the street and approached the pair of doors. They were sturdy, constructed of thick oaken planks held together with several horizontal iron straps studded with large domed rivets. There were no handles or keyholes, and he wondered if it might be barred from the other side. Will gave one of the doors a firm shove. It opened, though just a crack. Good, he thought. They weren't locked. Then, putting one hand on each of the doors, he lowered his stance and pushed with his legs. Moving smoothly on their hinges, the heavy doors slowly swung open, revealing what the wall had kept hidden from view. "The garden," he gasped. The doorway opened onto a paved terrace with several stone benches and a few ornamental trees planted in large ceramic urns. On the far side, opposite the doors, was a wide staircase that descended, perhaps 30 feet, to the garden below. Crossing the terrace, Will stood and took in the view. It was a vast area. On the east and west, the garden was bounded by the stone wall, but he saw no border to the south, only an endless sea of trees, the far end of which was shrouded in a fine mist. "It's much larger than anything I'd imagined," he thought, "but I did it." It was a garden, and many of the features he'd visualized earlier were there. He had intended this, and now it existed, which meant it was possible for him to influence the content of his world. As he stared into the distance at the hazy horizon, Will began wondering whether his premeditated creation, this garden, had the same structure as the rest of the world, and whether it had the same permanence. It would be a shame if this beautiful and much desired addition to the town couldn't be stabilized. He then noticed that the light mist obscuring the outskirts of the forest was becoming darker and seemed to be spreading toward him. "Is it disappearing already?" he thought anxiously. "Why? I don't want this to happen." With his fear rising, Will focused on the advancing fog, attempting to drive it back. But he quickly realized that the haze was a reflection, a manifestation of his concerns about the garden's stability. Everything in this world was a creation of his subconscious thoughts, not his conscious desires, and fighting against what he feared only gave it more solidity, more reality. As he had the night before, he reminded himself to concentrate only on what he wanted, crowding out any thoughts of undesired possibilities. He closed his eyes, took a few deep breaths to calm and clear his mind, and pictured the landscape bathed in brilliant sunshine, illuminating the smallest detail of the most distant tree. But he knew this wasn't enough. He had to remove all doubt that this image, held in his mind's eye, corresponded to the physical reality of this world. How would I feel if it were true, he asked himself. Relieved, joyful, at peace. A smile crossed his lips even before he opened his eyes, for he knew that his creation was intact. And to his delight, it had more than survived. Not only had the fog lifted, the entire scene appeared brighter and more colorful. The many shades of green, which dominated the landscape, were particularly brilliant. He could also see much farther. A few hundred yards to the south, the park-like grounds transitioned into a forest. A small range of jagged mountains stood beyond the woods to the southeast, perhaps a mile away. And far in the distance, to the south and west, a line of dark green hills met the sky. It was a good lesson, he thought. Not only had he saved his garden, he'd learned something valuable about the creative process itself. Now, he wanted to get a closer look at things. Will proceeded down the stairs and entered a small courtyard framed by a wall of flowering hedges and shaded by a single large oak tree near its center. Walking over to the tree, he laid both hands on the stout trunk. Patches of dark green moss grew in the deep crevices of its coarse bark. It smelt moist and earthy, slightly musty. It felt solid. It felt old. It felt alive. "If you're not real," he said, gazing up into its sheltering branches, "then what is?" After spending some time in the courtyard attending to details, and feeling confident that things here were stable, he considered taking a quick tour of the entire garden. But after giving it some thought, he decided against it. Will assumed that whatever was beyond his view was still fluid and unformed, and though he'd imagined many individual elements in his garden, he had no overall plan. "I should consider my options before locking things in place," he thought, "for it might be difficult, even impossible, to change things once they took shape. There's no hurry. It will be here tomorrow." The next morning, Will was jubilant. He'd brought the garden into existence, and he felt certain it was now a permanent part of his other world. It was a significant accomplishment, which opened up a new level of possibilities. He was no longer merely a spectator, passively enjoying the world presented to him. However, it did complicate the situation, for his ability to actively shape the environment meant he would have to make decisions and weigh consequences. One of the most wonderful things about his life in that world was the feeling of absolute freedom, the freedom from responsibilities. And Will didn't want to lose that. Things were now at a critical point in his second life. That night, after arriving in the square, Will made straight for the garden. He had little doubt it would be there, but since the doors now stood closed, and he hadn't closed them, a part of him still needed to be reassured. Coming to the doors, he pushed them open and saw that his instincts were correct. For the garden lay before him in all its glory, untarnished by his absence. Beaming, he crossed the terrace, paused for a moment to admire the panorama, then descended the stairs. Before going to sleep, Will had decided not to predetermine anything in the garden, intentionally at any rate. Rather, he would allow it to unfold naturally, as his inner self willed it. Not all at once, though. Not yet. He would explore today, but not too far. He passed through the courtyard at the bottom of the stairway and began following a flagstone path that wandered between the tall trees and beds of brightly colored flowers. Initially, it led him southward, but after a few hundred feet, it forked. Which way, he wondered. One path continued south, veering slightly to the east, while the other turned west. Since Will didn't want to lose sight of the town, he opted for the path to his right, assuming it would eventually lead him to the western boundary of the garden. It did, but since he moved leisurely, stopping often to sit and enjoy the scenery, it was hours, it seemed, before the surrounding wall finally came into view ahead of him. At this point, the pathway turned south. He left it, following a stream that emptied into a small pond, where a lone, weeping cherry tree, its long pink tendrils nearly touching the water, stood guard on the bank. Stepping up to the edge of the pond, Will spotted several small fish swimming just beneath the surface, the first animal life he'd seen here. The western wall was now less than 50 yards away. There was a small open gateway through which he saw a street and pedestrians passing by. No one entered the garden, however. Though Will had conceived of his garden as a common area, a public park, not his private estate, he'd never encountered other people within its walls. Maybe they need to be invited, he thought. Should I make some kind of announcement? But since the citizens were merely his creations, wouldn't they know his intentions and react accordingly, without having to be told they were welcome? Unless, deep down, he wanted the privacy. Sitting down on the grass beneath the tree, he leaned against its trunk and closed his eyes. What would happen if I dozed off, he mused, beginning to feel drowsy. Presumably, he would return home. But what if he didn't? What if his mind fell asleep and dreamed? Would he find himself within yet another world? And in such a place, would this world, in which he now sat asking these questions, be considered the real world? Chuckling to himself, Will opened his eyes. He wasn't ready to return home, just yet. What now? Should I see where that street leads, he wondered, looking at the side exit. No, that part of town, like the rest of the garden, should be left unexplored for now. Another day, perhaps. He stood up, brushed the grass from the seat of his pants, then turned and headed back the way he'd come. Making no stops along the way, Will soon reached the stairs leading up to the main entrance. He climbed them, crossed the upper terrace, and after pausing to take a last look at the garden, passed through the doors. As he made his way up the street toward the square, he noticed a rectangular plaque set in the wall above the gateway, surrounded by blooming vines. He took a few more steps, then stopped in his tracks and stared at the single line of bold letters cast in relief. Wysteria, he pronounced, reading the plaque aloud. Perfect. And thank you for joining me today, and we will return with Chapter 5 very shortly.